welcome to the Ghosts and Folklore podcast. I'm Mark Rees, and on each episode, I investigate a different, weird, and wonderful subject. And on this episode, we are going to explore the curious case, some might say the tragic case, of the female spirit trapped in her own personal hell, destined to spend eternity terrifying and hunting down the good people of Wales and further afield, sometimes as part of the wild hunt, at others as an independent lost soul. And what is fascinating about this figure is that while her origin is clearly rooted in legend and folklore, as you will soon discover, sightings and reports of encounters with her continue to this very day. This is a tale that weaves fact and fiction together into a truly terrifying account of a female spirit who has been described as a hag, as a witch, as a banshee, as a spirit of the night, and other derogatory terms. But in this episode, we shall refer to her with her original name, and this is the story of Mallt-y-Nos. And so, to begin at the beginning. And we are going to begin by taking a quick look at her connection with the wild hunt. And the wild hunt is a subject that regular listeners will be familiar with now. I've dedicated a few episodes to it already this year. If you haven't heard them, don't worry, you can still enjoy this episode, but this does relate to earlier Wild Hunt episodes. And just to get everyone up to speed quickly, the Wild Hunt in Wales, and for this episode I am talking specifically about Wales. There are lots of wild hunts all across Europe with their own weird and wonderful creatures. But here in Wales, based on Welsh folklore, the wild hunt occurs on certain nights of the year, usually saints' days and important holidays, when a group of supernatural creatures cross over into our world and go hunting. They go on a wild hunt. And as the name suggests, it gets a bit wild. And if you can picture something like a medieval boar hunt or a deer hunt, the kind of hunting you might have seen in a King Arthur film or an episode of Game of Thrones, it's like that, but spookier. Because instead of men on horseback, and it was traditionally men, although as we'll discover on this episode, not always, and the women were just as good, if not better, than the men. But instead of men on horseback doing the chasing, it is scary supernatural creatures instead. Scary supernatural dogs led by a scary supernatural master, the Cŵn Annwn, the hounds of the underworld, led by Arawn, the boss man who tore through the forest on a fiery steed. But this episode is dedicated to one of the most terrifying creatures on this hunt, possibly the most terrifying of all, whose blood-curdling cries, we are told, could be heard for miles around during this hunt. And that was Mallt-y-Nos, or as she is known in English, Matilda of the Night. Matilda of the Night, who is described as a hag who, with evil force, drives the dogs onwards. And who was she? Why did she act this way? Well, in the early 19th century, her origin story, as it were, was recorded, and it is described as a curious tale. And there's nothing I like more than a curious tale on this podcast. Every episode is a curious tale, and it is that curious tale that I shall tell you now. And it goes like this. There was once a beautiful but wicked Norman lady. It's always the Norman ladies. Norman lady who came in with Fitzhamon from Gloucester to South Wales. And the Fitzhamon referred to here is more specifically Robert Fitzhamon. who is a genuine historical figure who did conquer large parts of the south of Wales. He became Lord of Glamorgan in 1075, so this tale, as curious as it might be, has at least one toe in reality. But to return to this wicked Norman lady who came to Wales alongside Fitzhamon, and we are told that so passionately did she love riding, so passionate was she about riding after the hounds. There was nothing she liked more in life than riding after the hounds, and on one occasion she even exclaimed, "If I cannot hunt in heaven, I would rather not go there." So, this is a woman who loves hunting so much she would reject heaven to keep doing so in the afterlife. Now, personally, I can't think of anything worse. The last thing I'd want to do in heaven, if I was lucky enough to get there, would be to waste my time hunting. But that's what she wanted. She would only go to heaven if she could ride horses. And while we all know, thanks to a popular song, that you can skate in heaven, whether or not you can hunt in heaven, well, we shall find out soon enough. Because fast forward to her death, yes, this is a short and sweet tale, but fast forward to her death, and we are told that at her death, her soul was doomed to join Arawn, the aforementioned head of the Wild Hunt, doomed to join Arawn and his coon Annwn, the hounds of the underworld. Which seemingly answers that earlier question. It was slightly hypothetical, but nevertheless we have an answer. It's good news for skaters, bad news for fans of blood sport. You can skate in heaven, but no, you cannot go hunting defenseless animals. Which means that she did indeed go to hell. If not in a literal sense, but certainly she is trapped in her own personal hell. And she was destined to spend eternity with these hounds, with these fiery steeds, with these coon weber, to ride through lonely villages on certain nights of the year, and we are told that poor Mallt-y-Nos is to be seen as she wished, hunting through all the centuries until the end of time. And you might be thinking, poor is a strange choice of words there. Poor Mallt-y-Nos, whose wishes came true, who got what she wanted. Well, it turns out that maybe it wasn't such a good thing after all, because the folk story asserts that Matilda has long repented her impious wish, which is a fancy way of saying that a long time ago, maybe centuries ago now, she is really, really sorry for making that wish. And for this reason, her cries are often sad and pitiful, as she runs low down beside the spirit hounds, or takes an aerial flight with the coon weber, the hounds of the sky, or mounts a fiery steed and rides through the lonely villages on Christmas or New Year's Eve. So, whether she's on land or in the sky, running alongside the dogs or on the back of a horse, she is screaming in torment throughout. This is not a happy scream, this is a pitiful moan, because she is paying the ultimate price for having her wish granted. There's something quite Faustian about this, but she is now paying the price in the long term for having her wish granted. So maybe you can get too much of a good thing. This is an example of somebody getting exactly what they want to the point that they hate it. They've got exactly what they've wanted forever and ever and ever and ever, and it turns out it isn't that great. And it brings to mind, or at least it brings to my mind, an old Halloween episode of The Simpsons where Homer is in hell and he's getting fed donuts forever and ever and ever, although in that case he doesn't seem too unhappy. But maybe for most of us, for all of us except Homer Simpson, there is such a thing as too much of a good thing. But getting back to Mallt-y-Nos, and her torment can be seen, can be heard, more precisely I guess, can be heard over the Christmas period. Maybe this is a coincidence, or maybe it has some connection with the way she has displeased God. However, And there's always an however with these tales, a but. There's always a but with these stories. However, as mentioned at the start, accounts of Mallt-y-Nos do weave their way in and out of reality. Her tale is connected with some real events, and people have reported seeing her in more recent times. And folklore tells us there is a second version of her origin story, and it runs thus. A maiden who was very fond of hunting was betrothed to a man who made her promise to give up her favourite sport as soon as she married him. For a year or more after the marriage, she gave up all thoughts of hunting. But one day, her husband went away from home and he intended to be away for a little time, and I'm sure the alarm bells are already ringing. You already know this is not going to go well. And during his absence, his wife could not resist the temptation of the chase. So, mounting a splendid horse, she gaily rode away to the meet. Feeling sure that none of her friends would divulge her secret, she followed the hounds for a whole day. So, while the husband's away, the wife sneaks off to do a little bit of horse riding. How wicked this is in the grand scheme of things, I'll let you decide, but she sneaks off to do a little bit of horse riding. Sure, her friends will not drop her in it, and coming home in the twilight, after all that fun and adventure, her horse threw her. She was thrown from the back of her horse, and when her husband returned soon afterwards, he found his wife had broken her leg. And in one version of this story, see, there's multiple versions of the multiple origin stories, but one version of this particular story describes the husband throwing her out into the courtyard where she was seized by a whirlwind. We don't get many of those in Wales, but seized by a whirlwind, carried away and doomed to ride on the storm for all eternity. Another version describes her husband seeking the advice of a local Dyn Hysbys. A Dyn Hysbys, a magical man. A man who is described as a man well informed in matters that are dark to others. Which, again, sounds like a great description of this podcast, where we discuss matters that are dark to others. And this Dyn Hysbys, who, by incantations, threw his wife to the winds, among which she is doomed to whirl forever and ever. So either way, whether it was a naturally occurring whirlwind, might be slightly unlikely in this part of the world, or whether or not it was brought upon by magic, brought down by a Dyn Hysbys, either way, the result is the same. She was whisked away to ride the storm, hunting with the wild hunt forever. And I am sure there is a moral to that story somewhere, just don't ask me to explain it. Work that one out for yourselves. Now, to wrap up this origin story, and we are told that so late as 1850, so within living memory of when this law and when these accounts were recorded, old people mentioned her name with bated breath and referred to her as the wicked Norman lady, who would rather hunt than go to heaven. And sightings of this spirit began to emerge, not just on the wild hunt, but in specific places that you could, in theory, visit today. One such place is St. Donat's Castle in St. Donat's in Glamorgan, or the modern-day Vale of Glamorgan, where once a year Mallt-y-Nos was seen not hunting as on a wild hunt, but searching, which are similar actions, but are at the same time very different. I'm sure if we had a vengeful spirit after us, we would rather than be simply searching for us than hunting for us. And so she is not hunting defenseless animals here. She's not even searching for defenseless animals. She was searching for something much more interesting. She was searching for a soul. And not her own soul, but more specifically the soul of a notorious pirate called Colin Dolphin. And yes, that's really his name. The notorious pirate Colin, C-O-L-Y-N in this case. and dolphin, which is spelt D-O-L-P-H-Y-N. So the pirate's name is spelt slightly differently to the word used for those friendly mammals that do cute tricks in the water at times. And of course not to be confused with the American football team for my listeners in Miami. Although I guess you'd just call it football team, wouldn't you? But either way, we're not talking about those dolphins. We're talking about a pirate who is described as the Breton pirate. So the pirate from Brittany in France, who, from the island of Lundy, had plundered the Welsh coast in the period 1450 during the reign of Edward IV. And what his soul is doing trapped in this castle and why she is searching for it, well, that's a tangent that we'll save for another day. But going back to Matilda, it is said that this wandering and unhappy spirit was sometimes seen at the castle dressed in dull green. So this is a green lady spirit with a hooded cloak. But Matilda is, by all accounts, a lady of fashion, and in the Vale of Glamorgan, she was seen in dark red or in dark blue. So this is a spirit that's quite difficult to pigeonhole. We can't just say this was the woman in white. Well, we definitely can't say that because she didn't wear white. But we can't say this is the woman in blue or the woman in red. Those nice shorthands we like to use for these spirits. This was a spirit who liked to mix up her clothing. And if you did want to encounter her, or avoid her I should say, we are told that crossroads appear to have been her bane. And crossroads, which are an old favourite certainly in Welsh folklore and in many other cultures, crossroads, those places where ghosts can traditionally be expected to be encountered, and the devil and all other manner of creatures. Crossroads in this case appear to have been her bane, we are told. And if ever she chanced to meet one between Christmas Eve and Twelfth Night, she could be heard crying for help. And what this tells me here is that this would appear to be a spirit with seemingly a mind of its own. This isn't a spirit on autopilot that's just playing out the same situation again and again, because when they reach this spot, it's somewhere they want to escape from. It's somewhere they didn't want to end up in the first place. So clearly they've taken a wrong turn somewhere. They've become lost. They've ended up there. They need help, and really what they need is a map. But failing that, they can cry for assistance. And the good news, or the good news for her, I guess, maybe not the good news for us, is that when she does cry for help in these crossroads, assistance is sent, or assistance does come in the form of the Cŵn Wyber and the Cŵn Annwn, the hounds of the sky and the hounds of the underworld, who come to her assistance and set her on the direct route to her haunts. So these dogs from the wild hunts can come to her aid and set her back on the right track, which, like I said, is good news for her, bad news for whoever she is on her way to haunt, because nothing is going to stop her from arriving at her destination. So if you need directions, ask the dogs. Now, we are going to wrap up this episode with a look at another location that you could visit today, where Mallt-y-Nos is also said to be haunting, where she is also said to be searching for something in the depths. And that is Castell Coch, the Red Castle, Castell Coch, which will be familiar to many as that fairy tale castle that is seen peering over the trees as you drive along the M4 outside of Cardiff. And while there are a number of other more famous ghosts said to haunt Castell Coch, which I will dedicate another episode to and which I've written about in a number of my books, for this episode we will look specifically at Mallt-y-Nos because it's the Mallt-y-Nos episode, that's why. But it has been said that she has been heard there over the years. Those screaming, moaning sounds that are her trademark. However, this is one of those cases that might have a natural explanation, and it might already have been solved. It might have been debunked, if not necessarily stopped. Because in a more recent publication from the 1990s, I believe, possibly 1980s, but certainly not one of the older, dusty tomes of folklore, but in a more recent publication, it was claimed, or rather it was suggested, that maybe, just maybe, these tormented howls from beyond the grave, the eternal torment of this spirit trapped in its own hell, might, just might, be something else, because they were often heard at the same time as another non-human apparition was seen in the skies. And that is a flock of geese. A flock of geese that would regularly take to the skies as the sun set on Wales. Which would seem to suggest that either Mallt-y-Nos does not haunt Castell Coch, or if she does, she shares it with a flock of occasionally quite noisy birds. And if you wanted to be all poetic and pretentious about it, like I tend to be on this podcast at times, you could almost see this as being the reverse of Matilda, because while she is stuck down on earth in her own hell, in her own darkness, hunting for something she will never find, these geese are free to spread their wings, to take to the skies, to take to the world. They are free to go where they want, to do what they want. Their avian warble filling the sky with the sound of freedom that might, just might sound like the pitiful strains of a spirit trapped in torment that can be heard growing fainter and fainter as they fly off into the sunset. And on that very poetic note, it's time for me to do the same and to head off into the sunset. And that brings us to the end of another episode of the Ghosts and Folklore podcast. And before I let you go, I did promise an update on my next book on this episode, which I will get to shortly. But first, the usual end of episode stuff. And if you did enjoy this episode and you haven't already, please consider pressing the subscribe button. It's available in all the usual places. Well, wherever you're listening to it right now, I guess, but all the main platforms. And you can also, of course, subscribe on YouTube if you'd rather listen there. You can support the podcast by rating it, reviewing it, and telling all your friends about it. And if you really, really enjoyed it and you really, really want to support it going forward, you can treat me to a coffee via my website, which is always very much appreciated. If you'd like more Ghosts and Folklore, you can follow me on social media. And as well as this podcast, I've also written a number of books about similar weird and wonderful subjects, which are available from all good bookshops offline and on, including a new book which will be released in August this year. And that book is called, drumroll please, it's time for a special effect, Paranormal Swansea and Gower. Paranormal Swansea and Gower. And if you follow me on social media, or if you've been to any live events recently or caught me on any other podcasts, you might know that already because I can't keep my mouth shut, really, and I've let it slip. Also, the name has changed slightly over time, and I should apologise in advance if I do accidentally call this book Paranormal Swansea and not its full correct title, which is Paranormal Swansea and Gower. But the original title of this book was Paranormal Swansea, but at the suggestion of my publisher, it's now called Paranormal Swansea and Gower. And the very boring reason for this change really is simply that I write books about counties. So this book is about the city and the county of Swansea, and Gower is a part of that. So technically, Paranormal Swansea does cover the two of them, but as my publisher pointed out, if people are unsure if Gower is in this book or not, and Gower is a hugely important part of this book, by making it abundantly clear on the cover that yes, this is Swansea and Gower, don't worry, there is lots of Gower in here, then there's no confusion. So I was going for the simplistic option, and they've gone for the more obvious option, which is why they are the experts in selling books, and I am not. But more importantly, what's it all about? Well, if you've read any of my other paranormal books, you'll have a pretty good idea. The first one, not my first book, I've written about 8 or 9 now, but my first in the paranormal series was Paranormal Wales, which came out a few years ago. Last year, I published Paranormal Cardiff. This year, it's Paranormal Swansea. It again covers centuries of folklore and ghost stories, from the traditional old school stories of devils and witches and fairies right up to the more believable, some might say, but the more contemporary tales of poltergeists in living memory. And there is one tale which I'll probably talk about on the next episode, where we've uncovered some really, really exciting new evidence about a case that has been, well, I won't spoil it, but tune into the next episode for some really, really interesting new information that I think will be an exclusive for this podcast. And what's particularly nice for me about this book is, as you may or may not know, I think I've mentioned it on the podcast over the years, because I did start my ghost hunting adventures while working as a journalist in Swansea. That's what gave me the opportunity to go to these places, to spend the night in these places, to write about them initially for magazines and newspapers and things. And little did I know that fast forward 20 odd years into the future, I would be writing books about them and, of course, talking to people all over the world on podcasts about them. But it was nice to reflect, to go back to some of those old adventures, to include some much, much younger photographs of myself in that book as well. And when I do a paranormal Port Talbot book, that'll be the real autobiographical one, I guess. But in the meantime, this is the closest I get to some kind of autobiographical work. But I will talk about this in much, much, much more depth next episode. Next episode will be dedicated to Paranormal Swansea and Gower, of course. Anyway, that's more than enough end of episode waffle, so it just leaves me to say thank you very much for listening. Diolch and fawr am wrando. I've been Mark Rees. This has been my Ghosts and Folklore podcast, beaming to you from Wales to the world. And remember, the next time you hear the strange voice of a disembodied spirit drifting on the breeze as the sun begins to set, you might want to check the flight paths of the local birds before making a quick exit. Until next time, no star.